You are watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. In the next half hour, we'll see what's making the headlines with Zoe Williams and Wallis Simons. So let's see what's on some of the most front pages for you now. Well, the Sunday Telegraph leads with a warning from the Levelling Up and Housing Secretary Nigel Gove that the drive to net zero must not become a crusade and that some measures need to be relaxed. And on the subject of green measures, the Times reports that the Mayor of London is to rethink his ultra-low emission zone plans after criticism that it could have cost Labour the Uxbridge by-election. I'll shut woke banks. That's the front of the Sunday Express, which leads with a pledge from Rishi Sunak to tell bank bosses that they could be shut down if they close people's accounts for political reasons. The Mail on Sunday reports that a Remain backing campaigner has falsely suggested in a documentary that former Prime Minister Boris Johnson lied about nearly dying when he was taken to hospital suffering from COVID-19 in order to gain public sympathy. The Sunday People has an exclusive story about pictures of drowning victim Nicola Bulley from Lancashire being misused to set up fake accounts on internet dating sites, causing more agony for her family. The Sun reports that EastEnders star Patsy Kensit has split from her fiancé, a millionaire property tycoon, just 10 months after they got engaged. And while much of the rest of Europe boils in record temperatures, the Star reports that the British summer, so far at least, looks like being very wet and very windy. And a reminder that by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's newspapers while you watch us. And we are joined tonight by Guardian columnist Zoe Williams and the editor of the Jewish Chronicle, Wallis Simons. Welcome to both of you. Let's start by having a look at the Telegraph. And this headline, a quote from Nigel Gove: net zero can't become a crusade. What does he mean by that, Zoe?
I mean, I think it's pretty clear, and you'll see this coming through on the Sunday Times front page as well, that everybody's learning a particular lesson from the by-election results. Viz, that Uxbridge, for every known psephologist was saying that would be the first to flip from Tory to Labour, way ahead of Selby, because the majority was smaller. It was much more tainted by Boris Johnson. It was much more of a kind of, flagship target for the Labour Party. And then they didn't win it over this issue, which is essentially kind of seen as a green issue. That ULEZ, the residents of Uxbridge didn't want ULEZ extended into their zone. Now, what's happened in all the analysis, and this is certainly Gove's analysis, and it looks like Starmer's analysis as well, is that ULEZ has become synonymous with kind of hardcore environmentalism, which has become synonymous with the kind of thinking wing of the Labour Party rather than the practical fiscal wing of the Labour Party. So Starmer is trying to distance himself from that thinking wing, and the Tories are trying to position themselves in opposition to it, which is why Gove has suddenly started saying we mustn't make the green issue into a religious crusade, which is really surprising from Gove from a kind of political point of view, because he's always been an extremely, on the kind of green end of the party. He thinks of himself as an intellectual, and there are very, very few intellectual Tories now who don't acknowledge that the environment is an issue that surpasses party politics, really. I personally think they're all learning the wrong lesson from Uxbridge. I think it wasn't really about environmentalism. It certainly wasn't about the kind of soul of the Labour Party. It was much more about a campaign which was run as if speaking to that local issue, rather than a campaign that was run as if using that by-election in a message to the kind of wider Westminster bubble. It's very common for voters to absolutely rebel against being used as a bellwether rather than seen as a constituency in their own right. So I think it was really about the fact that the Conservative campaign ran on kind of on the ground stuff, not big picture stuff. And that's what got them over the line. So I think they'd be crazy. I think both parties are crazy to drop green kind of commitments now. But that does seem to be what both parties are doing.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem to be. Michael Gove calling for what seems to be a relaxation of some net zero measures. And he's citing the Dutch protests over emissions regulations, saying that the inflexible application of rules designed to reduce pollution leads to a backlash. So on his part, that's something of a U-turn, I suppose you can say, Jake?
Well, I don't think it's quite a U-turn, because although he's the first government minister to have spoken out in this way, he's not calling on the government to abandon the 2050 target for net zero. So it's not the target that's in dispute. It's merely the steps that are taken to get to that target, and whether the government is beginning to squeeze the public too hard, creating a level of resentment that means that people will turn against the net zero target because they're feeling it too heavily in their pockets. As Zoe mentioned, Uxbridge was turned by the Tories into a referendum on ULEZ. In fact, Keir Starmer said that he cannot have a situation where the Tories are simply putting a Labour policy on their leaflets and campaigning and getting a response from people who are against that policy. So Labour's, the ULEZ policy, his point was extremely toxic locally. Spending £12.50 a day just because you've got an old car clearly feels punitive to voters. And Michael Gove is really getting to grips with this, I think. And it is a really big question for the country, because very few people dispute that we want to get to net zero, and we want to get there as fast as possible for all sorts of reasons. We all want to live in a cleaner world, but there's a lot of argument about how we get there and the pain that is meted out on the public to try to force people, nudge people, persuade people, coerce people to change their behaviour. We've seen that with the controversy over the Rosefield North Sea oil wells up there. We've seen it in Michael Gove's own brief as Housing Secretary in terms of restrictions on landlords not being able to rent their houses out unless they sign up to these very demanding and expensive green renovations by 2028. We've seen it in housing restrictions in all sorts of areas of society. And there's beginning to be a backlash. I think Michael Gove is right to begin to talk about that and wonder whether we're not beginning to demolish our own house too quickly before we've had a chance to build a new, greener one.
He's certainly talking about relaxing the pace at the very least. Let's move on to another story in the Telegraph, one involving Nigel Farage demanding a formal apology from the BBC now, Zoe.
It's absolutely extraordinary just how much mileage Nigel Farage has got out of this Coutts business, right? So, I mean, I couldn't figure out what on earth had possessed them to release the minutes of the meeting in which they decided to close his account in the first place. Obviously, they didn't release them. That was a kind of whistleblower. Now he's upset at the BBC's coverage of the Coutts row, feeling that he's somehow been besmirched when nobody has besmirched him more than he himself. He sort of wades into this, makes the maximum amount of publicity, and then gets extremely upset when anybody says anything about this story, which he has created, that isn't exactly what he would have had them say. So I think the BBC should do what Coutts did and just say, you're not for us, pal. You're fine. It's not a breach of your human rights. It's just you don't get to run everything. But people do seem to find it really hard to kind of stand up for themselves against Farage at the moment.
Jake, what do you think? Is this his right to pursue this apology?
Yes, I mean, I have a very different reading of the situation from Zoe. I know the Guardian's line has tended to be, this is all a bit of a storm in a teacup confected by Farage, but I tend to see it a bit differently. I find it very worrying that that Coutts Bank took the step that it did to try to ban him from having an account just because it disagreed with his views. It's only one individual, although to be fair, we don't know how many other people are caught up in this net, but it's presumably not a very large number of people, but it's a very, very worrying precedent that banks can begin to use their power to enforce some ideological points of view which are not in line with British law, with criminal law. I mean, even criminals in Britain, there's no law banning them from having accounts, let alone people who have views which the bank does not agree with. And the BBC apology, I think Farage is right to ask for an apology because the BBC story was inaccurate. They reported that Farage was dumped by Coutts because he didn't have enough money, and that came apparently from Coutts. It turned out that he was dumped from Coutts because he didn't have the right views. He did have enough money to qualify for an account there. So these are serious matters, and particularly as cash is increasingly phased out, this gives the banks more and more power to control people's liberty, because if your bank account is closed down, if you haven't got the cash, you haven't got any freedom at all. So I do think it's a serious issue of freedom in our society.
Okay.
I mean, can I just come back on that quickly?
Zoe.
It's not a serious issue of freedom unless all banks are banning you. This is much more like if you go to your local and the landlord doesn't like the look of you and he bars you. It's not a civil liberties issue. You can go to a different pub. It's not a civil liberties issue. Nigel Farage can go to a different bank. It's nobody's right to bank in the most important, in the most expensive bank in the country. This is a silly story. And it just maddens me when there are actually serious things going on in the world to hear this talked about as if like anything depends on it. Nothing depends on it.
Jake, do you want to come back quickly?
I think we may have to agree to disagree on that. I mean, it's as I said, it's a dangerous precedent. Although we don't know how many other banks are doing this. We know that it's happened once with Farage and with some other people we've heard, but we don't know for sure. But the point is that a line has been crossed by the banks when they're starting to use their power based on an ideological position that isn't reflected in law. And let's not forget, Coutts is owned by NatWest. NatWest is owned 40% by the taxpayer. So it isn't like a pub. These banks have a great deal of power over our liberties and our lives. And I do feel that a dangerous precedent has been set here.
OK, well, Zoe, widening the story out, let's take a look at the Express front page, because we've actually got quotes from the Prime Minister, and he's saying that he'll shut woke banks. So taking the story wider than perhaps you might suggest.
Yeah, well, I mean, exactly. This is why maybe I should have kept my tirade until we saw the Express front page, because this is what's really driving me nuts. You know, the banks aren't woke. There's nothing in this story. Coutts is a tiny, weeny bank. Its policies don't reflect those of NatWest. They do not need to echo the interests of the British taxpayer. It's a very, very small, high net worth bank for a very small number of people, and it has views which we would probably find toxic every which way for very different reasons. So, you know, the idea that Rishi Sunak would then spin out from this one case, which Nigel Farage has blown out of all proportion because he's a narcissist and an egomaniac, the idea that Rishi Sunak would then make that his priority to stamp out wokery in banks just shows, I think, how absolutely running on fumes, not just his government, but his brain is. We've got really genuinely serious problems in this country. The item before the press preview was footballers taking poverty and cost of living more seriously than the Prime Minister takes them. You know, we're really, really in a problem. And Rishi Sunak is talking about Nigel Farage's bank account.
Well,
I just can't. You know, I'm sorry to be indignant, but it's ridiculous.
Just to say, Nigel Farage, obviously not part of this conversation, not able to defend himself. But just very quickly, you only got about 10 seconds or so, Jake. Your thoughts on the Prime Minister broadening this out?
Well, I disagree with Zoe's analysis there. Coutts is not a small bank. It's owned by NatWest, which is one of the biggest banks in Britain. And the boss of NatWest was the one who apparently, or allegedly, leaked the misinformation to the BBC. So Coutts is obviously very closely bound into NatWest. And I would just say that this is a big issue. Having said that, I can't see how Rishi Sunak would close down a bank for being too woke, given that the taxpayer had to bail out NatWest in 2008 to the extent that we own 40% of it.
Yes, good point. And also, just to balance out, we don't have the boss of NatWest to put their tuppence worth in. But for the moment, Jake and Zoe, thank you. We are going to take a break. Coming up, much more, including the back of the Daily Star, which says the Lionesses are off to a flyer after winning their first game in this year's World Cup tournament. Do stay with us. Welcome back. You are watching the press preview. Still with me, Guardian columnist Zoe Williams and the editor of the Jewish Chronicle, Jake Wallis Simons. Let's start by having a look at a good news story. The Lionesses off to a flyer, according to the Star. Zoe.
I mean, that's not actually what the piece said. The piece says it was a little bit squeaky and they seized a 1-0 win out of the jaws of something potentially a little bit less good than that. But I think there are so many hopes pinned on them now, having been ignored for so many decades, that they can do no wrong in anybody's eyes, whether you're interested in football or not. So, yeah, hats off to them. They've got through the first round in their Group D, and let's hope they win.
Jake, what are your thoughts? Do you think, along with Zoe, I think what she's saying is that they've been hyped quite a bit. Is it perhaps too much pressure on their shoulders?
Well, I don't know. I mean, look, these are the European champions and they were playing Haiti, which was, I think, 32 places below them in terms of world rank. So there was a sense that if you take a step back, they really should have done better. They should have been less sloppy in defence, should have converted more chances and won by more goals, not just one penalty. But then, look, let's just celebrate it. I mean, there's little enough good news as it is. This is an England team that's won their first match in this major competition. The country is behind them. Everyone loves them, particularly after they attained such prominence in the European Championships the other year. So the country is behind them, and we need something that we can unify and get behind and celebrate. And thank God there is something to celebrate. Yes,
let's hope it continues for much longer, all the way to lifting the cup. I probably shouldn't have said that. Have I jinxed them? I hope not. I hope not. I'll rewind. I didn't say that. Let's just have a look at the Express. No, we're going to have a look at the Sunday People. And I want you to tell me about Barbie, Zoe. This is the must-see movie, it seems now.
Yeah, I'm desperate to find out the secret of Barbie's favourite tipple, because I imagine they must mean Margot Robbie. One of the jokes of the film is that she actually doesn't have the gastric apparatus to drink liquid, so she has no favourite drink. It's really weird, this phenomenon. It's really, really strange. Whether you've got teenage kids or not, you'll have heard some hubbub, but you won't have realised until today just how many people in the country have gone to see it. I mean, the whole of London for sure was sold out. Everywhere you went, somebody was wearing pink. And it's really weirdly fun. It's much more fun. If you look at it and think you're not going to like it, you probably are going to like it. I'm not wearing pink on purpose by accident. By the way, this is sheer accident.
Has the phenomenon of Barbie reached you, Jake?
Yeah, I've got to say I don't know what's going on, but I tried to book tickets today. I was very disappointed when the website of my local cinema was so inundated it actually had collapsed and gone down. I wasn't able to see it. I want to see the Barbie film. What is wrong with me? It seems to have become a major cultural moment. You can't move for pink. You can't move for people talking about it. Everybody is raving about it. And I feel like I've got a real fear of missing out, a FOMO, because I didn't manage to get to see it today. But I'm hoping to see it. I can't believe I'm saying this, but I'm hoping to see the Barbie movie as soon as possible.
I hope you get tickets as soon as you can. It's not just for teenage girls, I've heard. Thank you both, Zoe and Jake.